So today we're going to start by talking about the beginning of Chapter 1, by describing the goals of psychology and defining psychology as a science, describing how you can critically evaluate new information using principles from psychology, and lastly, applying the major topics in this course to your professional and personal life. Let's start by defining what psychology is. Pause the video here to generate your own definition. Maybe write it down on a piece of scratch paper. We generally define psychology as a scientific field of study that investigates the brain, the mind, and human and animal behavior. Please note that I've made some important distinctions here. One, psychology is a science. We use theories and hypotheses to come to conclusions based off of evidence. We don't just use the ideas that your mother or your grandmother or your father or your uncle have told you that they learned about, because some of those things get rejected over time with the accumulation of new evidence. This is how science progresses, by continually evaluating evidence and making the best conclusions possible based off of that evidence. In addition, psychology is not just rational and scientific, but it's looking at how your internal processes, whether those are mental processes, right, so the mind, what you think about, for example, what did you have for breakfast 2 days ago? We tend to think of that as a mental process, right, as part of the mind. But actually, the mind and the brain are not different. We sometimes used to talk about the brain as being the physical component and the mind as being the spiritual component. Most psychologists today and most scientists would tell you that the mind and the brain are the same thing. That your mental thoughts, your emotions, and your feelings and those memories that you generate, like what you had for breakfast 2 days ago, are really the product of neurotransmitters and neurons interacting inside your brain. Okay? Those thoughts and feelings then lead to particular kinds of behaviors. So if you realize, wow, I haven't eaten a lot today, right, that may lead you to start looking for food. But psychology has three goals, right? Why do we do these things? Why do we look at the brain? Why do we care about the mind? Why does it have to be scientific? One, of course, is that psychologists generally really want to describe the world. We want to know what's happening around us. And again, psychology is not just the study of humans. We can learn a lot by looking at animals. Many of the studies we're going to talk about in this course are because of research in animals that has helped us learn about how neurons function, how people with autism may be missing certain facets of social behavior, and why that might be happening. A lot of that comes from initial studies in animals. So the first thing that we really want to do is we want to describe and measure the natural world. The second thing we want to do, though, is we want to take that information and we want to be able to predict the causes of certain events. What predictors lead to clinical depression, right? Can we intervene early if we understand those predictors? What kinds of things lead to happier, healthier relationships? If we can understand that, then we can intervene in those relationships. And that really brings us to the third goal of psychology, which is application, all right? The first two are critically important. We need to describe what's happening around us, and we need to understand and predict the causes of those events. But then hopefully those studies can be applied into human and animal research to help improve, for example, housing conditions or enrichment for animals who are at zoos or your pets. A lot of the work that we do in humans and animals has direct application, and not just for clinical psychology, not just for helping people with depression and anxiety, but it can help you learn how to study. One of the reasons that this class will use the inquisitive testing software is because research in psychology has shown us that students will remember information longer if they're tested repeatedly, right? So if I have you log into this inquisitive software and you've got to learn terminology and you've got to match them to the right questions, and it's a mastery software, right? So you can keep working on it until you get 100% or until you're happy with your score. Research shows us that those kinds of activities, rather than a test or a midterm where you come in and get tested on a bunch of stuff all at once, that by using this mastery software, you'll actually do better and you'll remember the terms longer. And I don't want you to just cram all this stuff in for the test, right? I want you to try to stop cramming if you can. I want you to learn this for application in your everyday life, okay? So these research findings are critically important. The other thing that psychology helps us to do is to be able to evaluate information. So this chart here shows the correlation, that means the relationship between two variables, and there are a variety of variables here. You can see on the bottom of the screen here the correlation coefficients. Now we haven't really talked about these, but we will later on in the chapter. But just so you know, higher magnitude, right? So 0.4 means that they're more closely related. 0 means they're not related at all. So what you can see up here is that these are ordered by magnitude from greatest up here at the top to least down here at the bottom. So you can see that smoking and lung cancer have a correlation that's reasonably moderate. The maximum correlation you could have is 1.0. This is just less than 0.4. That means that if you smoke, there is a correlation with your chance of getting lung cancer. That's pretty clear. We've been studying that for many, many years. Similarly, there is a correlation between media violence and aggression, and the correlation is just above 0.3. Then we can keep going down. We see here's the correlation between exposure to lead and IQ scores. These negative scores mean that more lead exposure leads to less IQ, okay? So one variable goes up while the other variable goes down, okay? You can see that correlation is only about 0.1, so that's pretty low. But right, parents are still worried about lead, right, and we want to try to protect kids as much as possible. But this sort of gives you a general comparison about which of these should you worry about more. This would suggest that the link between media violence and aggression in children and adults is pretty significant, and we might be concerned about it. But the kinds of things, when you see data like this, when you see exposure to asbestos and laryngeal cancer, when you see self-examination and whether or not you can detect breast cancer, one of the things I want you to realize is I want you to start asking questions about that study. These are some of the questions I want you to look at. For example, what is the source of the information? Is it biased? So for example, Cosmo just wants you to buy magazines. So they might put Cosmo just wants you to buy magazines. So they're going to put sensationalistic headlines to get you to buy their magazine, or at least to pick it up and look at it, hoping that you're going to buy it, when in fact the data may not be that good. Right? Cosmo is trying to get your attention and your dollars. So what are the credentials of the author? Are they a researcher? Have they been doing research on money, success, or happiness, and the freaky mind trip that's going to make that dream come true? Please realize that there's no freaky mind trip that's likely going to help you to be more successful. But there are things that we do know will make you more successful, and we'll talk about some of them in this course. So what's the evidence, right? Did one person do an anecdotal study? Did your Aunt Hilga come to you and tell you about this one thing you can do that will make everything better? Does she have a secret that'll help you to be successful? These kinds of things are important to be able to ask. But I want you to not just be questioning things you see in magazines, but I want you to question headlines you see in social media. Your friend shares something on social media, realize that of course they may be biased, they may be only looking at certain sources, and the information, even if it's presented in a scientific journal or a scientific way, may not necessarily if you actually read it closely. And I want you to get good during this semester at reading data and knowing whether or not the data actually supports the conclusions that are being made. But lest you think I only dislike Cosmo, there are examples of these in many magazines, like Men's Health, right? There's no new baldness cure. There's no way you're going to sleep better tonight that's immediate and fast, unless it's medication. And even then, that has side effects, right? So I want you to be questioning, and I'm sure most of you do, right? But sometimes when information is packaged in a scientific way, it's a person in a lab coat, it's somebody who has a doctoral degree or calls themselves doctor, you immediately start to trust them. And I don't want you to trust them. I, in fact, don't even want you to trust me. I lie all the time. My children know better than to trust what I tell them, and they're always questioning. I want you to be skeptical of everything you hear. Lastly for today, I want you to look at the list of topics at the end of the syllabus. And I want you to do a mental application exercise for me. When we talk about things like memory or relationships, when we talk about learning, how are you going to be able to apply these things? When we talk about emotion and motivation, how are you going to be able to apply that to your professional or personal life? Take a few minutes, write down some of these applications, and in fact, in the next video series, we'll talk about some of the ways in which psychology can be applied in your professional life.